You are very welcome to this long form question and answer session. Our first question today comes from Quimper, and she's asking, what on earth is going on? Because I watch these Vox Pop channels like the wonderful channel 420, and Russians on the street sometimes say that the whole West, not just Ukraine, are Nazis. I can't help but scream at the screen. What exactly, dear Russian on the street, is your definition of Nazi in 2023? I highly doubt that most of our democracies showing electoral love for authoritarian-style right-wing populists is what they have in mind. Rather, it seems that they're stuck somewhere between sometime before 1945. On the one hand, they say we're all Nazis, and on the other, that we are degenerate with our LGBTQ and so on. So what are they taught about Nazism, and how in their mind does it apply to people living in Germany, Italy, France, Canada, Sweden today, and so on? I think it's a great question. Let's have a go. Let's split it off between, I suppose, Ukraine and the West. So if you and I went to a market, let us say in Yekaterinburg, where wonderful Wall Street journalist was now arrested, where the ex-mayor of the city was recently arrested. We went to a market and we stopped a random under 30-year-old and we said, do you think that there's this sort of, concentration of Nazis in Ukraine? They would say, you're nuts. That would be the guess I would make about their answer. They would say you're completely, smoking something. But if we stopped at that same market, an over 65-year-old, I would give very few guarantees that they would resist the propaganda here. So there's a very big generational divide. And therefore, I genuinely do believe, that the story, this propaganda story about Ukraine has kind of persuaded a lot of the older generations. Some of the younger generations buy into it too, but I think what I'd recommend, if we stayed for an hour at that market and we kept asking young and old people and folks in the middle, I would bet a lot of money that there would be an absolutely apocalyptic tilt toward the older generations buying into this propaganda much more. In terms of the West, I think in the way that video on the main channel, which is not one of the best videos, but it's sort of useful. It just reviews an article that Patrushev wrote. Well, it's an interview he gave, in fact, at the turn of the year. And I think a lot of the sort of bizarre fever dreams of Russian propaganda are in that. But if we had to do a couple of brushstrokes about Russians calling the West Nazi, the biggest 20th century political narrative or myth in Russian culture is the myth of Russia as part of the Soviet Union playing a central role in liberating the world from fascism or from Nazism. That is absolutely central. And it's still possible to reactivate that myth and sellotape it to something to which it absolutely doesn't belong. And that's, I think, especially possible with the older generations. And I think in the last few months, there have been real efforts to tie the sort of narrative picture of this war to the Second World War in Russia. Obviously, this is going to fail to a very large degree, because there are not tens of millions of Russians walking around who think that Western countries are Nazi. That's not true. But that myth is powerful, and it does act on Russians, and it acts particularly on the older generations. So you can probably tell a story about how the West is developing Nazi-like tendencies in some dimensions, or how they're sponsoring fascism here and there, right? So I don't think you can quite get away with the argument that, you know, Germany in 2023 or France in 2023 are fascist societies, but there is somehow this new accommodation to fascist tendencies that's developed in the West, and we are on the wrong end of it, and because it's developed, we are now threatened and we have to do something about it. So I think that argument, I think, does make some headway, but if you presented it in its more elaborate form, it would flop, because that would just be absolutely crazy. It would be too crazy, too difficult to persuade Russians. And I think that this situation will get worse over the next few months. So a kind of a tying for a minority of the population, but this is the problem with, you know, a fairly populated country, that a minority either side is a heck of a lot of people. You know, the number of people who support this war in Russia, in not a kind of, oh yeah, I suppose I'm okay with whatever Putin does way, but in a direct way, I agree with the war for reasons X, Y, Z, and this is how we should prosecute it. The number of people who think that is relatively small in the population, but it's still a lot. I mean, you know, it's 20 million. And the number of people who are vehemently opposed to the war is a small percentage, but it's also a lot. So this is the problem when you're dealing with bigger countries. You've got a heck of a lot of people, even if it's just a minority. So what you've got now is this sort of pro-victory demographic that is more radical than Putin himself, that wants not the continuation of the war, not war for war's sake, but a victory. And they are, I think, pushing that story and absorbing that story relatively well. So, you know, this sort of thing will increase over the next few months. And interestingly, you know, I haven't been to Russia since the start of the war. I haven't been to Russia since just before the pandemic, actually. But it's clear that if you walk around Moscow, you are not going to see very many Zs. They're going to be really rare for now. But when you see something like that, you're often going to see not a Z, but some kind of bizarre saying, bizarre sticker on a car that says "On to Berlin," and then in brackets maybe we can repeat it. Можем повторить, you know, we can repeat it. And so now there is this sort of tie of the myths around the Second World War with this large-scale escalation against the West. I hope that's a couple of cents that offers you something. Our next question comes from Jaroslav, and Jaroslav is saying, can Russia be removed from the UN Security Council? Why is the UN not fulfilling its mandate and dousing war flames? I think how I feel about a question like that, Jaroslav, depends on where it comes from. And that kind of question might be okay, but it also worries me. Here's the bit that's worrying about it. That things would be okay if you kicked Russia out of the UN Security Council. and they won't. Greg Uden, a wonderful sociologist, political philosopher who I always recommend, has an expression about this that I don't myself quite share, because I think it's more constructively optimistic than my view of international politics. But Greg says, and I do think it's a really nice thing to say, he says that the debate about Ukraine, Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, is really a debate between hyper-conservatives and conservatives. The hyper-conservatives want to go back to the 19th century, that's the Russian side, and the conservatives want to go back to February 23rd, 2022. You know, there's this camp that thinks, oh, if we just sort of go back to before the war, everything is going to be okay, but it's not. This is what Ukrainians were also telling us for a long time. Things weren't okay before February 24th. The international system is not in good shape. The West does not have a picture of the future. The West does not have a picture of its future. The West does not have a picture of what Europe is, what kind of situation should obtain on the European space over years to come, what Ukraine and indeed Russia should look like in years to come. So it's very important to not buy into the thought if you just plug Russia out, then things are going to be pretty. That's a mistake. And again, let's look at how many global agents sponsored the Putin regime. The Putin regime has been held not by the support of the Russian people in the first instance. It's been held in place by the fact that the Putin regime as an international network has been propped up all over the place, formally and informally. So if we put aside this sense of the question as perhaps reaching for a kind of a panacea, which I'm probably assuming you're not, how would we answer it directly? Well, I'm not an expert on international institutions, but roughly the answer is no. As far as things look at the moment, the answer is no. I mean, there is, as I understand it, a mechanism to kick somebody out of the UN, but there is no mechanism to kick somebody out of the UN Security Council, to kick out a permanent member. And you are therefore going to struggle to kick Russia off the Security Council without kicking it out of the UN, and you can't kick it out of the UN because it's on the Security Council. China is not going to be on board with this, and it's not clear how other countries would. I mean, the UK does not want these precedents changed. I mean, for instance, if Scotland separates, the UK will want to inherit, right, its position from before Scotland separated. So relitigating who is the correct inheritor of the USSR, as it were, is not going to be popular. And there, I mean, who could you argue for as an inheritor instead of Russia? Well, Ukraine or Belarus. You don't want Belarus because it's part of the war, and it's a tyranny, so Ukraine. But I mean, that's a nice after dinner conversation. I don't see any reality to it, and I don't recommend that conversation to be had apart from a wider conversation about what needs to happen in the international system, right? What proposals we have for ordering a little bit the international order as it was before the war, because it was quite disordered. Do we have any such proposals? What do they look like? What does the West not only want, but what standards does it need to hold itself accountable to? right? Why is it that major international principles that the West insists on are regularly violated by the West itself, and so on? So I think it's a good question, but it needs to be had as part of a wider conversation about the international order, and it needs to be had apart from sort of magical thinking that you just plug Russia out and everything is hunky-dory. Because in a certain way, the international order was complicit in the production of what we've now got coming out of Russia. Our next question comes from Dom, and Dom is saying, I got something I need advice from you on. I'm dealing with a relative who I love like a father, who is the kindest, most gentle and intelligent person I've met, who has nevertheless been captured by Kremlin propaganda, to the point where it feels like he's on a different planet. I try to engage with him, but it's hard. Here's a sample of some of the stuff he thinks. He says that Mussolini's definition of fascism is when corporations and the state merge, and that's what we've got in the West. He thinks there's no free press in the West. He thinks that Bucha is made up by Elliot Higgins. He thinks that Ukraine is Nazi. He thinks that the BBC is the finest propaganda machine in the world. Above all, John Pilger, who worked for them. Well, John Pilger has very little to do with the BBC. A lot of people I love actually have John Pilger books on their shelves, but John is a man eminently easy to dislike. Sovereign countries have to be free from corruption, but NATO just sort of imperially dominates everybody. So there's a lot more to this, and he's turned away from what he calls mainstream media and is following independent investigative journalists on Instagram and Twitter, which has led him down a rabbit hole of conspiracy theories. He has particular contempt for the BBC and thinks the West is just as corrupt and compromises Russian media. How do I engage with him? Where do I start? We have a friendly relationship, but I can tell that my attempts make him uncomfortable to sort of change his mind, and he shuts them down pretty quickly. There are things that some people don't want to do, and then there are some things that people just can't do, and it's not realistic or even fair to ask that they do them if they can't do them. So I think that, reason is and always will be a slave of the passions, and you have to start with what somebody is feeling, So, I was asked a question by Jaroslav about the UN, and I'm not an expert on UN process. So if somebody came along and said, well, there is actually a sort of a legally accessible way to kick Russia out of the UN Security Council as a permanent member, here's how it looks, I'd be interested in that. So I'm engaging with this conversation essentially from the vantage point of both curiosity, but also a sense of what's my lane and what isn't. So I gave more the political context around that kind of question than specifically talked about UN procedure. So you see, that's where I was coming from. But I could be coming from a place of fear about some kind of pattern of co-conspiration and domination by some kind of institutions that really affect my life, but don't feel acceptable to me, accountable to me, and don't feel transparent and don't feel ethical. So what's somebody feeling is what you start with, right? And that's why I always have this like a broken record conversation about don't hit the disinformation, look at the distrust underneath. What are the patterns of distrust underneath the expressions of disinformation that we see. So I think that that's very, very important. So don't ask for something you can't get. Don't ask of somebody to give something that they can't give, and don't ask them to, do something if them doing it is predicated on a false assumption about what it is that's really going on when they express these views, right? I am a big believer in relationship and intimacy, both in personal life, but even in this kind of public intellectual conversation. I think that there needs to be some kind of an ongoing conversation that then facilitates people to explore and so on. So I think that I always recommend relationship. I always recommend a sense of psychological realism about where somebody's coming from. And I recommend, not asking for something that somebody can't give you. And, also exploring your own desire to change that person. Like, where is that coming from, and why is it so essential? And might it not be that you have some romantic views about that relationship that aren't quite realizable? And that maybe there are, certain insuperable kinds of gaps between you that you can't bridge, and that you shouldn't do magical thinking about that, because these gaps aren't a fault of the relationship. They're a feature of it as well, But you want to start with, being realistic about all of that, but also being realistic about what significance that person has for you and what love you feel for them, So that's not a solution, but that's kind of some of the aquarium in which I think I'd place this sort of situation. Samantha is asking, what can we learn? This is a bit of a summary of the question on my part. What can we learn from Ukraine to protect our own democracies? I think that's a very interesting question. And maybe it's a question that exposes a little bit, failures on my part to express my message properly, or to connect different bits of my message together properly. The way Ukraine has stood up to the Russian invasion is, very moving. It brings tears to your eyes for two reasons. Because of the defiance against the Russian invaders, but also because that defiance has taken some distinctly Ukrainian forms that are continuous with some of Ukraine's cultural myths. And it's certainly remarkable to look at Ukrainians, but also to look at Belarusians and say to ourselves, even though that is a cartoonish thing to say, and in many ways it's not accurate, but still to say to ourselves, well, they are fighting with everything they've got to keep something that or to get something that we rather take for granted and are rather allowing to slip between our fingers, even though we've already got it. I think there's quite a bit to that, a kind of a moral reorientation of Western citizens into sort of a big picture perspective. But I think that moral reorientation only happens room by room by room by room, and it cannot happen on a large scale. And that's because the problems we face with our democracies are in good part to do with social forces that aren't really touched by sort of galvanizing our spirit about how we love democracy. And unfortunately, Ukraine is going to find that out itself after the war. And Ukraine is going to be less well-armed institutionally to handle it than some Western democracies are, because they're long established. We have extraordinary patterns of economic fluidity. We have all kinds of extraordinary patterns set in motion by the way our online space is organized, with a kind of disinhibiting and polarizing set of effects there. We have, as a result of this, an incapacity to come together around a shared sense of citizenship, increasingly. And that's why when we fail to do so, it's wrong to say it's just a moral failing. It's wrong to say it's just the irrationality of people on the other side. It's not. They rather are inexorable social forces. So when we sort of morally galvanize ourselves, what we need to say is not that we can solve the problem just through that kind of galvanization, but that in galvanizing ourselves, we recognize that there's most of the problem that we in fact can't control. But there's a bit we can to some extent control. And we'll be able to control that bit well only if we recognize that there are bits that we can't control. As the public intellectual Mark Liller likes to say, there are forces, social forces, a kind of social physics, this is a terrible scientific term, in our societies that is doing this to our societies rather than bringing them together, pulling them apart rather than bringing them together. And so, back to the question, there's a bit we can learn from Ukraine, but the main bit we can't. And in fact, Ukraine's going to be, as a post-war democracy, exposed to all of this. And, it needs to be supported to equip itself properly, because this sort of untethering that's happening in Western societies is happening against the background of very strong institutions, right? All the trends, let us say, in US politics at the moment, all the major trends are negative. But US institutions are so strong that you can degrade US democracy for quite a long time before it's going to collapse. And Ukraine will be sort of pushed out into all of these global forces without a fully prepped seagoing vessel. It'll be partly a seagoing vessel, partly a flat-bottomed riverboat. That's why it's going to need a lot of luck and a lot of support post-war to stabilize itself. Because, we do know that history teaches us that you cannot base what comes after on the kind of unity that is available at a time of direct conflict. So I think we can learn quite a lot from Ukraine. We can get inspired by Ukraine, but we must realize that to make this sort of inspiration most practically efficacious, we need to immerse ourselves in it while also recognizing what we cannot control. John is asking, with the news about Ivan Rosomachin, the Wagner soldier who's taken out of jail and then upon return to Russia is accused of murder again, is the Russian population becoming more concerned about the side effects from this war? Not yet. Do you think this will cause any changes to the approach of the Putin regime, and will this cause longer lasting consequences for regime stability? Yeah. You are going to have a bunch of traumatized and armed and unhappy people, or people who know how to operate arms and are attuned to life and death situations. You're going to have that bunch of people all over the country in time, for when the regime wobbles. That's a very major plank of danger for the regime, right? And together with Putin floating Russia's borders by declaring bits of Ukraine to be Russia, and thereby bringing the war onto Russian territory, and with all of the already glaring expressions of the decentralization of the monopoly over organized violence. I mean, you've got Mr. Kadyrov in Chechnya with his own folks. You've got Mr. Prigozhin with his own folks. And you've got also, I think, throughout the Russian army, the sense that the soldiers are fundamentally accountable to those in charge at the local level. So there's already a kind of precarious dissentedness in the way the Russian military is constructed. So there are all of these, extraordinary expressions of the central state's potential loss of monopoly over organized violence. And when the situation wobbles, that would be very dangerous for this regime, because it may more readily meet violent action, violent opposition at that time. So quite certainly it's a big problem for Putin. And it's also, I think, a factor that increases the risk of the latent civil war already in place in Russian society becoming activated. So it's not an emergency risk now, but it's an absolutely catastrophic sort of danger for the regime when it's vulnerable the way it's not vulnerable today. Lola is asking, how do Ukrainians troll/interact with Russians? And how do Russians feel and tick, and how would you speak to Russians versus how you speak to us Westerners? What are the cultural macro and micro dynamics from an insider's perspective? Well, the Ukrainian state is very good at trolling Russia, and Zelensky is quite gifted at always inserting something as soon as a little crack appears in discourse in Russia, in the little intra-Kremlin conflicts and so on. Ukrainians in their private capacity do an enormous amount of trolling online, and Ukrainian kids do a lot of trolling of Russians on YouTube Shorts, on TikTok, often through these sort of, I don't know what the apps are called these days, but they used to be called, I don't know, chat roulette, all that kind of stuff. I don't know what the latest versions of these are, but there's a lot of Ukrainians trolling Russians on these platforms. And of course it's very funny because Ukrainians are completely awake to what's going on, and then you have these Russians whose head is stuffed with various kinds of myths about what's going on, and you see these stupid conversations where Ukrainian is saying, well, we've got this kind of destruction, we've got people having to abandon their homes, we've got flattened cities, we've got people dying, and the Russian will come back with something really cretinous like, Yeah, but like I've watched a lot of Ukrainian children on TV, and they use swear words a lot. So like, can you explain why that's happening in your country? How'd you let that happen? Um, so there's a lot of really stupid, cretinous sort of Russian fantasies about what's happening in Ukraine that are comically exposed by Ukrainians online. Um, I don't watch it much, but it is very fun to watch. Um, and how would you speak to Russians? Well, you would address them in terms of their interests and their concerns. So you would hit very hard what is wrong with Russian society. You'd hit the bizarre hierarchical nature of the society, the politics that Russians are stuck with. You'd hit the extraordinary lack of boundaries in every aspect of life, including formalized life. You're always sort of oppressed by your boss or your, slightly senior colleague in some kind of, informal way, and it's the norm, and then they are oppressed by the person above them. You talk about the extraordinary inequality in Russia. So you'd hit Russians in terms of their core interests. And then you'd start painting them a picture of their future. Because what they're really stuck with is a forever Putin picture. So can you show them something beyond Putin? And that's still something the Russian opposition are struggling with, because they're showing them what's bad about Putin, but they're not showing them what's beyond Putin enough. And a lot of Russians are now stuck in this kind of forever war mentality. In other words, even those Russians who are skeptical of the war, except the ones who are perhaps vehemently and transparently opposed to it, maybe they do see more of a future, but even there I'm not sure. But what's there beyond the war? What happens if you stop the war? What do you want to happen then? So there's just a complete inability for Russians to see beyond what they've currently got, which means that completely eviscerating what they've currently got doesn't solve their problem. Because if you show them, well, you've got a regime that is illegitimate and it's in all kinds of ways abusive toward you, and it started the genocidal war against your neighbor completely unprovoked. Okay, but what next? Like, what do we do about this, and what comes after? That's what's missing at the moment. That is one of the things that one would speak to if one spoke to Russians, and that's why my videos are of curiosity to Russians, but they're absolutely not for Russians. They're not. They're fundamentally videos that are about Western concerns, Western curiosities, Western fears. I would speak to Russians in a very different way, but it's not my job to speak to them. I just don't have that much interest in speaking to them, in the sense that I probably would if I were fully well and I had all the hours in the day, but it would be sort of YouTube channel number 6, as it were. So that's a little bit on this, but I'm sure we'll come back to it more. Next question's from Shawn, and I'm going to take it briefly because in a way I've almost gestured at the answer. Shawn is asking, what do you think the Russian flavor of democracy will taste like? And beforehand, you talk about how I say that I'd speak differently if I spoke to Russians. I don't want to repeat myself. Look, the prior question for Russians is what holds us together? What holds them together? That's the question they've got to ask of themselves after the war. And by after the war, I mean really after the war. Because if Putin's kicked out of Ukraine, that's not necessarily going to stop the war. So Putin's entire project of escalation against the West needs to end, and the Putin regime needs to go. And then the Russians are going to have to ask themselves, what holds us together? And if there are going to be answers to that, they can only be articulated once the state is reformed and massively decentralized and federalized. Unless that happens, it's not going to be possible to, as it were, in an institutionally realistic way, for the country to have a conversation with itself about what holds it together. And if it turns out that nothing holds it together, the country is going to fall apart. So the question here is not what is the Russian flavor of democracy. The question is rather who is there on that territory, who has a chance of sharing a civic identity with each other. And once you answer that, then that group that shares a civic identity may begin to engage with the question of what the flavor of that democracy is. So a different way of putting this would be that the answer to to what the flavor of Russian democracy is, and I'm contradicting myself somewhat here, but not really, because what I said didn't have to be analytically transparent. But this other way of putting it would be to say the first part of the answer to the question of what the flavor of Russian democracy is going to have to be about what holds Russia together, if anything, right? And there could be some very dark blanks that come out in response to that question. So there's plenty of ground to be pessimistic there. Claire is asking, how do ordinary Russians manage to survive and live sanely in such a swirl of misinformation, lies, and flexible realities, while all at the same time knowing that their son or their neighbor's son is there at the front lines? I think, Claire, that the casualties are still too low in such a depoliticized society to create a major disequilibrium. And I actually think the casualty rates can go up quite a bit still without destabilizing the situation, except perhaps in the long term and the medium term. In terms of how Russians survive such a wash of postmodern absurdity, well, as you know, I'm with those who sort of in a preliminary way break up Russian society into three bits: the blob in the middle, and the bits that are on either side that are for and against the war. The insanity of it motivates the depoliticized blob to stay depoliticized. And the folks who are clearly against this, and they know that it's wrong, are at risk of, I think, losing the plot. And I think that some of the anti-regime, or at least independent Russian media that's mostly been evicted, have been aware of a bit of a drop in numbers of folks following them among those who clearly already agree with their message and oppose the war and oppose the Putin regime. And that might be a reflection of these people just checking out, even from information they approve of, just to survive in the shell of their private life, the shell of day-to-day subsistence. So I do think that particularly among that oppositional group, there's a risk of people going potty because they know how wrong what's happening is, but they don't have the understanding that it's possible to constructively act against this. In other words, it's not clear what they can do. I mean, they could come out into the street, but they'll get arrested very quickly. If 1,000 of them come out, they'll get arrested. If 500,000 of them come out, well, who's going to organize that? And even if they did, the regime would just imprison and shoot them. But so that wouldn't work. But then to come out, you need much more organization and much more capacity for collective action than is really available, partly because the Putin regime has been so keen on just depleting the capacity of the population to engage in collective action. That's been a program of the regime for a quarter century. And on the other hand, the opposition are all abroad or in jail. So it's hard to balance the fact that what's happening is wrong and insane with the perception that you can't do anything about it. So that's how they feel. And then the pro-war folks are riding on a wave of various kinds of imperialistic feverishness that don't really require, for their position, for their analysis of the situation to be analytically coherent. So that's a little bit of an answer. Chuck is asking, if somebody like Putin has to lie through his teeth to speak of a special military operation, what does that say about what he actually believes? Can one lie that much and still believe in a just cause? Well, I think that here you have to create a lot of room for compartmentalization and doublethink and sort of thinking something but also not thinking it. There is certainly quite a lot of that going on, and that's how you have such an uncomfortable balance in Mr. Putin between, if you like, gangsterism and missionary zeal that would seem to pull in opposite directions, but in fact kind of coexist in him. He is not somebody who in private has an unstable sense of what he thinks is true. So in that sense, he is not a classic example of a post-truth politician, somebody who says one thing on a Thursday, another thing on a Tuesday, and then doesn't have a stable private belief about it either. So it's a kind of a really entrepreneurial relationship with what's true that even affects where they're at in private. Putin has very clear ideas of what's true, but he just sees all public speech as political technology. Like, why would you not lie? So in other words, it's not that Putin can even be described as lying. He can neither be described as a post-truth politician, classically speaking, nor can he be described as a liar, because he just sees speech as political technology. So there aren't really times when he is, if you like, out of that mode. And I think to call a politician a liar, you need them to regard some speech as real and legit, but other speech as an opportunity to make stuff up. Putin doesn't make a distinction like that. Everything he says is instrumentally calculated. Speech is just another political tool. It's not tethered to the truth, but privately he does have a stable sense of what he thinks is true. And there's a lot to the thought that might is right. And then you can explore the coherence of that kind of idea. How far can you coherently think that might is right? Because if all there is might, then how do you distinguish might that's right from might that's not right? I think in practice for Mr. Putin, you come out with a picture where there are major powers that ought to be given their own spheres of influence. I think he believes that. But then he also believes that you can keep extending your sphere of influence and eventually you can lose it if somebody is powerful enough to take it away. So even with his idea of multipolarity, it's not completely stable, because even on the international scene, the only reason he thinks that Washington isn't Russia is because it isn't Russia yet, as it were. Not that it realistically could ever be Russia, but if there were an opportunity to make it Russia, well, then why not? So that's a bit of an all-round ramble. I hope it's of some value. Next question comes from Tom. If and how can Russia ever deputinize, given the lack of any real oppositional movement and the fact that Russia is uninvadable and therefore can't be denazified like Nazi Germany? I think it's very important that Russia is uninvadable and as a nuclear power. It would be different if it weren't. I mean, Russia is in the middle of a kind of unbelievable imperialist frenzy at the moment, and that frenzy will crack at some point. It's just a question of how far it goes and how far it's allowed to go. And when it cracks, we're going to need to see what happens, how Russia can reconstitute itself. Can Russia reconstitute itself on a more democratic path without breaking up? Certainly the younger generation want and would demand change. The older generation are in a different place. So we're just going to have to see what happens. I mean, I don't know quite what you mean when you say bound to be. Nothing is bound to be what it is. Nazi Germany, if it were never invaded, would have experienced change. So, I mean, the only thing that's really continuous there is perhaps certain kinds of culturally persistent political deformations, right? Some kind of imperialist syndrome too. And that lasts, and that's hard to eradicate, and often events help eradicate it. And then the only other argument I suppose you could make for permanence is if you thought that Russia just could not reform itself constructively without separating. That's a view that some people are close to having. But otherwise, I don't understand what it means that it's permanent. Nothing is permanent. You say that there's no real opposition movement. Well, there can't be in a tyranny. It's going to be repressed until it isn't repressed. There is no opposition movement until there is an opposition movement. So I think, I do agree with you. I think that it's worth being pessimistic about Russia's chances of change. And I'm not one of those people who feel that if the Putin regime collapses tomorrow, things are going to get dramatically better quickly. But nevertheless, the idea that things can't change there'd be no sociological level on on which that claim could make sense about any society. So this kind of slightly brief, abrupt answer is my effort for today, if that's okay. Ace is asking, can you speak about the reasons for the spectacular achievements of Russian propaganda, both in developing nations and in the US? I don't see spectacular achievements of Russian propaganda in the US, I'm afraid. I see some marginal achievements, often done with sloppy tactics, poorly executed. I think that there certainly are attempts on the part of the Russian propaganda machine to intensify conflicts we have at home and forms of polarization and toxicity we have at home. And so I suppose one very big reason is the crisis of trust in public institutions, and that kind of dynamic of societies being pulled apart that I think is making us much more vulnerable to Russian propaganda, plus Russian propaganda fuels that too. I think there are attempts by the Russians to reach out to the to the anti-democratic populist right. There are very few attempts, except just in terms of some discourse, very few attempts by the Putin regime to reach out to the left. I think that could actually have some success doing that. Not that that would be a good thing, but they could. So yeah, I mean, they're, as soon as you begin talking about the right in the United States or in Europe, it's worth breaking it down into two categories. The right that is committed to democratic checks and balances, and the right that isn't. And the right that isn't is a demographic that the Russians are trying to reach out to and establish links with them. That's an important factor, but the key explanation for the efficacy of some Russian messaging, I suppose, is that we're having a crisis of trust at home. And we are having a crisis of citizen belonging at home. And it's easier into that kind of ecosystem to insert bits of toxicity that have a destabilizing effect. So I think this is a really important question, actually, so we will be talking a lot more about it. Marcin is asking for a comment on the situation in Israel, and lots of people have been asking for that for weeks and weeks, and I'm going to disappoint you because I think the comment I want to make about it is a comment from a distance. Now, the proposed legislation in Israel was going to dramatically impact the separation of powers. So it qualifies in my books as partly breaking the democratic game. And that's something very important. And in Israel, there is still the possibility to fight back against it. Israel is enough of a democracy to fight back against democratic backsliding and potentially win, the way Ukraine did in 2014, for example. And I think this goes to the very heart of why I started my YouTube channel. And I talk about love, but love as a public intellectual is often about being very ethically adequate in the way you manipulate. Being a public intellectual is a very manipulative enterprise. Being an intellectual is not manipulative. You just try to get at the truth, or at least to get at something truthfully. As a public intellectual, you're always pulling and tugging and slowing down and speeding up people, and it's inherently manipulative, and that's why so few public intellectuals have good intent. You have to sort of be manipulative out of love, the way good teachers are, for example. And so one of my biggest manipulative schemes with all of you, is that nearly the most important reason this channel is started, it's joined equally most important with a few other reasons, is to create a situation where we have a community and a conversation that gets us ready to react appropriately if and when the democratic game begins to be broken in our country. Because what's absolutely critical is that people do not sleepwalk through a situation where their democracy is disintegrating, but they can still do something about it and stop it. And that's incredibly important. And that is why I endlessly talk about these distinctions among political forces on the right, telling apart those who are pro-democratic from those who are not, which does not map on to whether you're more or less right-wing. And that is in part why I talk about identity politics and wokeism, because one of my theses is that woke political engagement, which is, as I see it, apolitical engagement with politics, will sleep through, will encourage its exponents and proponents to sleep through that critical moment because they're not going to notice it. Right. So one of the most dangerous things about the current identity politics is that it encourages people to be completely unawake. It's the irony of the term wokeism, unawake to the situation when your democracy is wobbling and you need to act constructively and not just theatrically and expressively. So I think that's probably as important a reason for the existence of my channel. And I know that unfortunately that situation will arise for many of you in 2028, in 2032, but it'll arise for many of you. And we're already heading in that direction, but one of the marvelous things about a lot of the established democracies is they have a big reserve of institutional resilience, such that years of parasitic politicians and parasitic polarization will still be compatible with the sustenance of significant democratic checks and balances. But what is absolutely critical is if you miss these opportunities, then you get to a stage where you can't get rid of the regime anymore. Once it's muzzled enough checks and balances, it becomes irreversible. And that is why you've got to see things as they are and not worse than they are. And that's to say, to really recognize when these moments come. And in these moments, acknowledge the situation for what it is. And as is appropriate for you, act on that or speak about it at least. Once you let it go beyond a certain level, you can't get rid of the regime. So, a lot of tyrannies are only removable as they are taking hold. Once they've taken hold, you have to then wait for them to collapse or to be defeated in some kind of war. And that's why that moment is absolutely critical. And part of the mission of this channel is to ensure that we are transparent and awake about this situation if and when it arises in France, in the United States, in Austria, wherever. Where in Britain, where you're feeling okay, enough fractures have been incurred by, let's say, counter-majoritarian institutions that are essential to the sustenance of democracy, that we're really at a pivotal point where this is sort of, a few minutes to midnight. If we don't act now, then it'll be too late. We'll be facing a consolidated authoritarian system, and then there'll be no way to get rid of it. Maff is asking, how do you see the origin, rise, and evolution of future right-wing eco-groups coming about over the next few years? And what do you think the driving force behind such groups will be? I might struggle to do this justice, so I'll be brief, but I promise to return to it properly. To clarify, by driving force, I mean, will they be driven by genuine ecological concerns? Yes, they will. Or will they be, or will this be an indirect concern for them? In other words, they'll be exploiting the climate issue, but not serious about it. Perhaps preventing climate change to head off mass migration from the global south may be the main aim, and eco-activism is a means to that end rather than that it's an end in itself, something like that. Okay. So it's something I keep my eyes on. If you like, the rise of eco-fascism or soft eco-fascism. At the moment, even though people in the climate movement are ready to call out things as eco-fascism, frequently these things are almost always not eco-fascism. It's a real problem at the moment that the climate movement is I think less significantly committed to a left-wing politics, and more significant committed to identity politics. That is to say, you can only come on board if you agree with positions A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and they might be something like the primacy of the global south, not open borders, but a very open immigration policy, and racial justice. The problem is some citizens are on board with these commitments, but other citizens are not. Well, that just means that your movement can never have general citizen availability, right? It'll always be for some groups, but not others. And there's a kind of a myth in the climate movement that either right-wing people will become left-wing, which obviously isn't going to happen, or that right-wing people will always remain climate skeptics. In other words, they'll be skeptical of the current climate science. And that's an absurd position. That is extraordinary how many people in the climate movement think that, but it is an absurd position. Yes, there are many mechanisms of denial of the kind of picture that the science gives us at the moment, and some of these mechanisms of denial have been set by fossil fuel companies in the 80s, and lots of these mechanisms of discourse are still controlling us. But the point is, no, I'm sorry, much of the right will little by little start snapping out of climate science denial. Now, acknowledging climate science doesn't translate into social positions, into what and how we should respond to it. But climate science denial will not persist in anything like the form that it's persisting now. And I think there's a terrible mistake in the climate movement. So, yeah, I mean, you're going to get pro-climate politics all over the political spectrum in the 2030s, including anti-democratic authoritarian politics that, in fact, does not exploit the climate as an issue, but takes it very, very seriously. The climate crisis is really real, and we're going to have to, given that it's real, prioritize white people. We are going to have to shut our borders. We're going to have to engage in all kinds of discourse about us and them, protecting us from them. And them might be people outside our society, there might be people living inside our society. So toxic exclusionary politics will absolutely embrace the climate crisis in the 2030s. And the imaginative failure about this in the current climate movement is breathtaking and, in fact, tragic. Next question's from Michael, and I'll be brief because I'm really at a big risk of repeating myself here. Does the Russian population hold any responsibility for what their elected government is doing in Ukraine? In two bits, are they ethically responsible for it? And what do they actually feel? Are they ethically responsible for it? Yes, they are ethically responsible for it. How many Russian citizens are responsible for Russia's war in Ukraine? Every single one. Every single one. Are the citizens who are responsible the citizens who are sort of depoliticized and support the war? Or are citizens who are opposed to the war also responsible? Citizens who are opposed to the war are also responsible. All of them are responsible. The Russian opposition that's in the West is also responsible. But responsible doesn't mean blameworthy. and we've got to enrich our vocabulary of ethical implications. That's the ethical position. In terms of where they're at, I do think that those who are vehemently opposed to the war feel responsible. On the whole, the depoliticized blob just doesn't feel responsible, and you can see it. You can see it. You know, you can just look at some of the Vox Pop channels on YouTube. People give you the answer, I don't do politics. Well, you're still ethically responsible. So the depoliticized blob in the middle does not feel responsible, and the people who are pro-war and are responsible feel responsible too, in a kind of perverse way, often in a kind of sadistically perverse way. So that's a brief answer. Nick is asking, in the hypothetical future where Russia fails to gain what they view as adequate success through this conflict, where does this end for the Russian state? Such a bellicose foreign policy in this day and age is wholly reliant on great battlefield success that is seemingly unattainable for Russia at the moment. So the answer basically, in my view, is that Putin's regime is now tied to the idea of an escalation against the West. And that's not going to stop, as I said to Jake Bro the other day, even if Russia's kicked out of Crimea, unless the Putin regime collapses. If Russia's kicked out of all Ukrainian territory and the Putin regime survives, it's not going to stop this war against the West. So the Putin regime is basically going to carry on with this until this project snaps. You know, the only way it won't be doing things, and indeed it won't be doing things potentially for several years, is if it can't, out of capacity. But if it can't, it'll be preparing to do things. It's now educating young children into the idea that there'll be a major confrontation with the West when they grow up. So the ideology of the regime now is a big war against the West, and that doesn't go away until the regime goes away. And attempts to involve Russia in a big conflict with the West will not go away until this regime goes away. So that's my answer. Sparkling Soda is asking basically how to informationally get through to Russian people. Taking over a Russian TV channel by hacking it and broadcasting war scenes seems a bit blatantly propagandistic. So what methods of getting through would work? What would their framings be, so as not to come off as so propagandistic that they wouldn't even be able to reach the Russian people? So this is the wrong question. I don't think there's any problem of reaching the Russian people. YouTube is still working in Russia. It might be cut off soon, or they might try to cut it off. But there's no such problem. The folks who are in this kind of revanchist imperialist hysteria aren't going to be remotely affected, even if they, watch the sort of information that we agree with all day long. The depoliticized blob in the middle doesn't have an information issue. It has an evasion and denial issue. The more information you give it, the more it's going to look away. Because facing that information, I apologize, I'm repeating myself, facing this information will mean acknowledging that their relationship with politics, their outsourcing of politics to the Kremlin, is ended up in disaster. So the problem I have is that at best, projects of getting information through to Russians are sort of quaint, and at worst they are a basic misunderstanding of the problem. There is no informational problem, and that really means that to act and to politicize, that depoliticized blob in the middle needs to see possibilities of action. Just giving them pictures of brutal crimes in Ukraine doesn't give them possibilities of action, it just freezes them even more, because they see this and they either sort of try to evade the situation, or they say, okay, that's real, but what are we going to do about it? We can't do anything about it, and therefore we're just going to retreat further and further into our shell. So it's very important that it's a mistake to think that the Russian people need information. They need the sense that you can do something about it. And when that sense is both available and realistic, then they will all begin to question the war and the Putin regime. So the problem is not ignorance, it's evasion and denial, right? Which presupposes you actually have a pretty good idea of what it is you're turning away from. Next question's from Brian, and this one could be a bit intricate and unresolved, and it's a reflection of Brian's experience. So skip to the next one if this begins to feel too much. So let me try to read Brian's experience a bit, and then I'll respond. Brian's experience is not my own experience. My question is how to join the struggles against racism with Ukraine's fight for independence and democracy. When I have talked with black friends and colleagues about the war and the horrors committed on the ground in Ukraine, many will share stories of horrors in their lives and in the lives of their families on the streets where they live and work. Their stories are full of pain and suffering, implying that their personal horrors outweigh any horrors in a foreign country that is white. I work with Ukrainian American churches and organizational programs to aid Ukraine. When I speak about the need to join the Black civil rights movement with the movement to help Ukraine defeat Russia, no one sees the connection. Okay. And then Brian says the neighborhoods where most Ukrainian Americans live, white suburbs, are in voting districts that voted preponderantly for Trump. It must be clear to them that Trump is an ally to Putin. This is Brian speaking, not me, who has thrown Ukraine into a life or death struggle. Well, he hasn't. Speculation is that he might. Hopefully this, and it already is in one, hopefully this creates an empathy for the life and death struggles of black Americans. So you're trying to draw the connection now the other way, that those who support Ukraine would connect up more with civil rights struggles expressed via presumably BLM, but also via other non-BLM anti-racist social justice projects. Okay, let's begin unwinding a couple of these things and making them more generally accessible, right, than this particular context. So, just because one argument for something is the best argument to make for it doesn't mean that other arguments can't work too. So in the case of Ukraine, I think that the compassion argument has quite a bit of leverage. And I think that's why a lot of you, in fact, are watching the content you watch on YouTube. However, I don't think the compassion argument or the human rights argument is what gets us clarity with Ukraine. What gets us clarity is that Putin isn't at war with Ukraine, he's at war with the West, and Ukraine is bearing the brunt of that. So I think that the key argument is that it's about key national interest, not that it's about compassion. I think the compassion argument will be increasingly the losing argument with Ukraine over time, but it'll still win. Losing arguments still win, they just get less people on board. So all the arguments in favor of supporting Ukraine have a place, but the main one is got to be a non-compassion argument. And somebody who is impartially compassionate might just say, sure, about the tragedies in Ukraine, but point out to many other tragedies in the world, many other conflicts, and indeed diseases that could be solved with funding. So there is space for that argument, but there is a feverishly out of control expansive imperialistic project that goes far beyond Ukraine and would if we let it, and that is threatening the world with nuclear war. So that's where you start fundamentally, and then you move on to other arguments. That's the first point. Second point is just that when people try to persuade people, it's very important that folks can jump onto the same train going to destination A, but for different reasons. I jump on train to destination A for reason X. You jump on train to destination A for reason Z. We're both on board, but we're not both on board for the same reason. I mean, you might be on board with that train. Let's say it's some kind of a policy in your country because you think it's economically efficient. I might be on board because I'm a Quaker, which I'm not, but if I'm a Quaker and it aligns with my values, somebody else might be on board because Karl Marx told them so, or Ayn Rand told them so, or Jesus told them so. So that pluralism is really, really important. Projects win when they allow people to come on board for different reasons. Now, somebody engaged in a social justice project may feel that it would be diluted if another cause were added to it or connected with it. So it's possible that somebody just wouldn't want to expand their horizon. They might just say, look, that's really important, but not everybody can care about everything really important. This is our project here. If that's really important, Ukraine is really important, please let's mobilize more people to work on supporting Ukraine. But that's not going to be primary for us. And there might be reasons for that are political and strategic. In other words, our project gets diluted. For instance, because what we are pushing for is divisive, and then Ukraine is also a divisive issue. So if I add a divisive issue on top of a divisive issue, I'm going to run aground here. And let me stick with the one divisive issue where I'm trying to get more, galvanize more unity. So that's possible. That's possible too. And then in terms of folks going the other way, no, personally, I have extremely limited optimism that folks in the States, presumably have been there for a long time, Ukrainian folks who've been, there perhaps since some of them since before the collapse of the Soviet Union, others after, that through caring for Ukraine, they might care about other social justice causes. No. They're going to see BLM as left wing, very left wing, and not their politics, which I think is wrong. I don't think BLM is left wing. Interestingly enough, that's the wrong analysis. But I don't see how Republican voting Ukrainian Americans are gonna, via caring about the crisis in their former country, start to care about other things. Is there a way around this and around some of the other things I've said? Yeah. I believe that transformation is at its most powerful at the local level, when people have actual relationships, and there is evidence for this. I mean, there is evidence that, for example, Islamophobia falls quite rapidly when you get communities together. And if I'm a bit Islamophobic and you're a Muslim and we're together in the same community, we're not talking about Islam, we're talking about how the damn roads are organized here and whether we're going to keep our local park. A lot of misconceptions dissolve that way. So engagement at the local level is one of the key sort of 3 or 4 pillars of democratic regeneration, interestingly enough. So, Brian, none of these are answers, but they are just little brush strokes in response to your question. Jörn is asking, would Putin use the election as an off-ramp? No, absolutely not. He can't have an off-ramp now. I know I am into wishful thinking here, but if he chose to do it, how would he have to design the process? Choose a successor or deliberately let it slide and form the propaganda beforehand? So I suppose this could be something like a story of saying that a bad outcome for the Putin regime in Ukraine is still a kind of victory. And so there's a situation in which that's possible, and there's a sense in which it's not possible. It's possible in the sense that Putin could say, the big war with the West is still coming. This is how we finish the first chapter. But it'll do. First chapter done. There's going to be more. So in that sense, he could do off-ramp, but it wouldn't be an off-ramp against his sort of large-scale imperialist frenzy. It will be an off-ramp to prep for chapter 2. And an off-ramp that is an off-ramp off from the whole project of wanting to challenge the West, wanting to dissolve NATO. That is impossible, and the complete disowning of that project is just not compatible with the sustenance of the regime. So they're locked in with that. So I hope that's an answer. Pavel is asking 2 questions, and I'm going to kind of cheat on one because I feel we've done given a couple of cents on it at least already. What's wrong with the American right? Well, there is a part to the right everywhere that is not interested in the democratic game anymore, is interested in breaking it. That's not true of all of the right by any means of the imagination. So there is the democratic right and there is the post-democratic right. And don't mistake that for distinction about how right-wing one is, right? You can be very, very right-wing and pro-democratic, and you can be mildly right-wing and anti-democratic. And there are different pathologies in the center and the left that we will talk about too. So I think that what I would say is that there's this process of coming apart of the social fabric that creates the possibility for a sense of citizen belonging to a single polity, right, which is shared with all citizens, despite disagreement. They're opponents when they're opponents, but they're never enemies. So that's coming apart, and there are very complex social forces that we briefly touched upon earlier in this Q&A about why that's coming apart. And this is only going to get worse, I'm afraid, much, much worse. And it's going to be a question of really the resilience of institutions and whether there's going to be any efficacy to mechanisms of democratic regeneration or not. And about those we'll talk about too. But one way to get your democracy to move in a direction of democratic regeneration, at least in some aspects, is to stop doing things that we are capable of stopping doing that degenerate democracy. We can't capable of stopping all of them, because this is really absolutely essential. Our democracies are not declining because we're doing 17 things wrong, and if we stop doing them, we're going to be okay. No. There are mechanisms that are out of our control, right, that are leading to democratic decline. So we can't just stop all of it by working out what the problem is and fixing it. But a lot is in our power, and we will explore what we can do about it. So that's a couple of cents for now, but we will go there much more when I do content about how to save Western democracies. Who can the Russian opposition unite around is Pavel's question. It's the last question of this Q&A. So one of the biggest problems the Russian opposition has had is a lack of, if you imagine two circles, but instead of two, there might be 22 in reality, but imagine two circles, they're different sort of expressions of the Russian opposition, different groups. There is not this, which is this little area of overlap here. There is not enough of this. And so if I am, let us say, a Russian who's run away from Russia half a year ago, and I am, God knows where I am in Georgia, or indeed I am even in the West, I'm in Germany, and I need to ask and answer some questions. For example, should I participate in street protests, right? And should I try to organize street protests of Russians just protesting the Putin regime, in different countries? Should I do that? Should I not? How should I do it? And then I need to look at some kind of unified presentation that integrates all the Russian oppositional groupings and guides me. That's not available, really. I'm still largely looking at 1722 different groupings, different voices, and they're saying that, and they're saying this, and like, well, how do I bring this all together? And the answer is you don't. They need to bring it together, God damn it, and they're not doing that. They are still very quarrelsome and divisive. And so, first of all, what you need is the idea that there is substantive coalition-like convergence among the Russian opposition. That doesn't mean they come together and they say they're one entity or they agree with each other on everything, not at all. But they've got to come together and agree on some things, such that I can say, well, there are 22 Russian oppositional groupings out there, but all of them, right, have created these resources, which they all back, which they all approve of. And I can be guided by that. So that's very important. And then beyond that, there's going to be competition between figures like Navalny and some others, if Navalny survives indeed. That's going to be put to the test when there is more possibility for action, when the Putin regime is in trouble. And then we're going to see who the leaders become. So that's it for the moment. Thank you so much for enduring this very, very long Q&A. I look forward to being back with you soon, and also soonishly on the main channel with a very interesting video about Russian imperialist mentality. Lots of love. Talk soon.